Hello, everybody! Welcome to another installment of From Pixels to Pictures, the series where we take a look at film adaptations of video games and try to figure out what went wrong. And today, we're looking at a real shitstorm, so you might want to grab your umbrella. As storytelling in video games became more sophisticated over time, we started to realize that games could tell stories in any genre, and that included horror. Video games have the potential to tell horror stories really well because the scary things are actually happening to you. And when it comes to horror in gaming, it doesn't get much more iconic than Resident Evil. Released in 1996, this game was absolutely groundbreaking. It coined the term survival horror, and it spawned a franchise that is still going strong today. Because the game took so much inspiration from horror movies, the idea of doing a film adaptation quickly became popular. After a little bit of workshopping the script involving a certain famous director, more on that later, Paul W.S. Anderson was hired to direct. Anderson was a fan of the game, and he was responsible for Mortal Kombat, which up till that point was considered the best video game adaptation, so it seemed to make sense on paper. The film was released in March of 2002, starring Milla Jovovich, Michelle Rodriguez, Eric Mabius, James Purefoy, and Martin Cruz. It actually opened the same day as Ice Age and came in second behind that film. I guess that was the weekend of movies that aren't very good but somehow are going to get a million sequels. Anyway, the film made just over $100 million at the worldwide box office, tripling its budget, and because it came out around the same time as 28 Days Later, both movies were credited as reviving the zombie genre. And without getting too far ahead of ourselves, they did make 5 sequels to this movie, making it by far the longest-running series of video game adaptations. While the Resident Evil films are not critically acclaimed, they do have their fans, so clearly there's something there that works. Now I just have to figure out what that is. Let's take a look at how one of the most iconic horror games in history made the transition from pixels to pictures. Quick disclaimer, I only played the first Resident Evil game for this video, and I plan to make my way through the games as I cover all of the movies, but I know that this game does take some inspiration from the second and third games, which I have limited experience with. And I tried to do my research, but if I get something wrong, please let me know. Round 1, Characters. So let's get this out of the way. None of the characters from the Resident Evil games are in this movie. The filmmakers chose an interesting approach with this adaptation. Rather than directly adapt a story from the games or involving the established characters, they decided to tell a side story, something that theoretically occurred off-screen within the same canon as the games, while at the same time making sure that anyone who doesn't know the games can still follow the plot. Honestly, it's an intriguing idea, and we'll get more into that in future rounds, but for now, just know that all of the characters in this film are new to the movie. Milla Jovovich stars as Alice, a character who was reportedly meant to be a stand-in for Jill Valentine in the film, and I think it shows because this character is honestly about as compelling as your typical video game protagonist from this era. The character is meant to have amnesia, and Jovovich plays her as being very flat and not having much emotion, which you could argue was an intentional choice, but I feel it's more likely that Jovovich doesn't have the most expressive face. I'll give her credit for being talented at martial arts. She did all but one of her own stunts, but sadly, it wasn't enough to get me to care about this character, who seems very flat and doesn't have much of an arc. Michelle Rodriguez plays Rain, a member of the team who gets bitten early on and is slowly losing herself to the infection. This is the one character in the film I really cared about, and it's entirely because of Rodriguez's performance. The role isn't written terribly well, but Rodriguez is able to find the humanity within the character, making her arc a legitimately tragic one. Incidentally, James Cameron has cited this film as a guilty pleasure of his, and he singled out Rodriguez's performance as a highlight, and he ended up casting her in Avatar, so that's gotta count for something. But how are the rest of the characters? I gotta be honest with you, they didn't make much of an impression. So one of them is Spence, who Alice was pretending to be married to before she lost her memory, and he also has memory loss, but he was secretly the bad guy. And he acts pretty righteous before getting his memories back, but when he does, he's like, well, guess I'm evil now. It was a rather sloppy transition. Then there's Matt, who's the one that Alice is trying to save in the end, and also something about him and his sister. Oh, there's Kaplan, who's the one who tries to sacrifice himself, then finds the will to keep going, and then dies anyway. And I'll be honest, as I'm writing this, I have to keep glancing at Wikipedia to make sure I've got the names right, because these characters were not memorable. And when I was watching the movie, it was impossible to get invested in their story because I had to keep reminding myself which generic-looking white guy was which. The only other character that's worth mentioning is the Red Queen, an AI program that is initially presented as the main antagonist, and then is ultimately revealed to be trying to prevent the T-Virus from getting out using admittedly harsh methods. As a character, she doesn't fit at all with what I've seen in the Resident Evil games, but at least she's one of the more interesting characters. I thought having her take on the form of a child as a failsafe solution was unique and made her oddly creepy, but again, the inclusion of an AI character in this story, it just feels really out of place with the universe that the game set up. Usually in these videos, the characters round is where I have the most to say, but honestly, I don't have anything to say, because there just isn't anything to talk about. This movie is much more focused on the action and the visuals than the characters, and that's really one of the film's biggest failings. It's not like the characters are written really badly either, they're just not written to be interesting. Even in the game, which features relatively simple characters and notoriously bad voice acting.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
Noted. But despite that, I was still more interested in the characters from the game than the characters in the movie. I appreciate that they tried to go in a different direction, but you could have at least made these characters more likable and more compelling than what we got. Michelle Rodriguez is the only person who manages to overcome the weak screenplay, but she isn't enough to save the movie in this round. As the film goes on and certain characters die off, I should be feeling upset, but instead I'm just relieved that there's one less character to keep track of, which to me is a sign that you failed. I'm giving it a score of 3. Round 2, setting. Now, I want to stress that I'm basing all of my comparisons off of the original game from 1996, but obviously the other games have explored a vast array of different locations. The first Resident Evil game is set entirely in and around the house known as Spencer Mansion. It is a giant location with so much to see and do, and the game brilliantly uses everything in its power to catch you off guard in this setting, from the layout of the house itself to the offsetting color palette, to the predetermined camera angles that leave you guessing whether or not you're walking towards danger. The player does eventually leave the mansion and we see the laboratory, but that's not until the last third of the game, and the fact that they keep you waiting for it is a large part of what makes that final segment so effective. Which is why the film setting was such a big letdown for me. Because we do see the mansion in the film, but we're only in it for about 10 minutes, if that, and then we're immediately spending the rest of the movie in the laboratory. And even though the laboratory looks close enough to what we saw in the game, it doesn't have the same feel because the game knew to save it. I will add that in some of the flashback scenes, they show a graveyard with eerie-looking statues and crows, and that looked right out of the game. But if you couple that with the little bit of the mansion that we see, having these moments be few and far between almost seems more cruel than not having them in at all. It's like they're teasing us. The big takeaway here is that the movie leans more in the sci-fi / action direction more than horror, which is a real shame. I'll admit that on their own, the sets look pretty good. It does feel like a real laboratory, but heightened just enough to feel at least plausible as the same universe as this video game. But if the goal was to recreate the environment that we saw in the last third of the game, okay, they did a pretty decent job. I like the inclusion of the Umbrella logo everywhere, and there are certain moments that take place in half-flooded rooms, which that comes right out of the game, so that was good to see. But, I'll even go as far as saying that I like the cinematography, and there are moments that feel like deliberate callbacks to the camera angles that we saw in the game. I think more work could have been done with the lighting and color palette to make the mood feel closer to the games, but On its own, the cinematography and production design are genuinely solid. It's certainly far from perfect, and the fact that they tease us the mansion but don't allow us to spend a lot of time there does hurt the movie. But I can't say that they completely failed, and so in this category, I'm giving the movie a score of 6. Round 3, Story. So, like I said before, this is not the story of the original Resident Evil, but rather a side story. The idea of this movie was to present a narrative that theoretically could take place off screen within the narrative of the game, but still make it so that people unfamiliar with the game could follow along. Now, I've only played the first Resident Evil so far, but I've looked up a plot summary of the second game and that helped clarify things a little. The first game has multiple endings, but in the ending I got, everyone made it off the island safely and the T-virus was contained. But then Resident Evil 2 opens with the start of the zombie apocalypse. The movie feels like it was meant to take place in between the two games to explain how the virus got out. Now, usually I try to advocate that these movies should tell the same stories as the games they're adapting, but I have to admit, this was a good idea on paper. However, I found myself very uninterested in the story that this film was trying to tell, and the big problem for me right off the bat was when they introduced the character of the Red Queen. I don't know about the sequels, but there was no mention of an omniscient AI in the game, and this change to science fiction was a curveball that really caught me off guard, especially since for the first part of the movie we're led to believe that the AI is the main conflict of the film, and it takes a while for the zombies to show up. And oh, while we're here, the AI that we're led to believe is the antagonistic force behind everything is called the Red Queen, and the protagonist is named Alice. Even though I didn't pick up on this during my initial viewing, they tried to include a lot of references to Alice in Wonderland, I guess in an attempt to make this movie a modernized retelling. I'm not really sure why, since none of that is in the games. Just because you throw in references to a classic work of literature, that doesn't mean you're automatically telling a good story. I thought the movie could have had something interesting going on with Alice's amnesia, and the possibility of her being responsible for everything, an idea that actually does come from Resident Evil Survivor, although why you'd want to take from what's considered one of the weaker games in the franchise is anyone's guess, but the fact of the matter is, I didn't care about that. I didn't care about any of these characters outside of Rain because there was nothing about them or their stories that compelled me. For anyone familiar with zombie movie tropes, this movie feels very stale and unoriginal. I'm racking my brain trying to think of more things to say, but the fact of the matter is this movie simply did not leave much of an impression on me. As I'm writing this, I watched the movie a week ago and details of the plot are already slipping from my brain. It's not that the story is terrible, there's definitely some passable stuff in this script, but it's just so boring. I think they should have done another pass on this script and maybe hired more charismatic actors, and then it would have worked a lot better. As is, I'm glad that they at least tried to respect the canon of the games, which is more than can be said for some of the movies I've looked at here, but if you're going to make up your own story, then you've got to come up with something good, or at least memorable. I'm giving it a score of 5. Round 4, Experience. If it seems like this review is a little shorter than usual, it's because I've saved all of my main points for this category. Because the video game Resident Evil isn't really about the story or the characters, it's about the experience. The game is trying to give you the sensation of being in a horror movie. In fact, one of the biggest inspirations for the game were the classic zombie films of George Romero. And that's why Romero himself was initially in talks to direct this movie. He even wrote the first draft of the screenplay, which would have involved the game's characters and stuck pretty closely to the plot of the first game. But at this time, Capcom was experimenting with the game's sequels, and they wanted to lean in a more action-oriented direction with them. They thought that the movie should have more action as well, so they took Romero off the project because his script was too similar to their game. I grieve for the version of this movie we never got, because the horror aspects of the game were what made it special, but there is very little actual horror in this movie. The most horror we get is in the opening sequence, which shows the AI turning on the humans, and the entire bit with the elevator legitimately scared me. But after that, the fear factor in this movie was down to almost nothing. I think a big part of that is because we very rarely see a character deal with a threat alone. Instead, the team is almost always together, which admittedly makes more sense from a practical perspective, but it's much easier to fear for a character's safety when they're alone. Now, that's not to say that the movie is completely unfaithful to the games. The zombie dogs and the lickers are pretty spot on. And like I said before, the look of the laboratory itself does feel consistent with what we saw in the game, but it's the sci fi elements and over reliance on action that prevents it from being a good adaptation. As a film on its own, it does have some merits. I think the makeup is pretty cool, albeit not the most convincing, and the action scenes for the most part are well choreographed. The scene with the lasers has become the most iconic scene for many people, and while it's not like anything from the game, it is pretty cool. However, I do feel like the final scenes of the film feel a little bit off. Like, the final encounter with the liquor is cool, I guess, but when it was happening, I didn't realize that that was supposed to be the climax. I thought that there was going to be one more big scene where Alice got closure to her character arc in a really dramatic way. And for me, there was something really surprising about realizing that no, this is the end of the movie. It felt really abrupt, and maybe I'm the only one who felt that way, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Now that I've seen both this film and Mortal Kombat, I can say that Paul W.S. Anderson has an eye for cinematography and is good at blocking action scenes, but he's not very good at directing his actors. He puts most of his emphasis on action and visuals, and very little of it on characters and story. And I know that to some people that's what they want to see in a movie. I know that this movie has its fans, otherwise it wouldn't have gotten as many sequels as it did. And if you enjoy this movie, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But for me, this kind of action film really isn't my cup of tea, especially when it had the potential to be a really effective horror film. Before I watched this movie, I remember looking on IMDb and being really excited that Marco Beltrami, the composer of A Quiet Place, was also composer on this film. That seemed like such a perfect fit to me because the game is a brilliant horror experience, and A Quiet Place, while not exactly the same, shows it is possible for a non-interactive piece of media to still feel immersive, like all the horror is happening to you. Instead, the score in this movie is fine for what it's trying to do. It's this bombastic action score with techno in it. But that's just not my thing, and it's not what it could have been. This whole movie could have been something really incredible, which is why for me I was very let down by the finished product. I'm giving it a 3. So, with all the scores added up, Resident Evil gets a score of 17 out of 40, 42%, for a final score of F. When I look back at the Mortal Kombat review, I feel I was a bit too harsh, and maybe I'll rectify that someday, but I don't want you to think I hate Paul W.S. Anderson. Everybody has their own style, and hey, he's made more movies than me, what do I know? It's just, this style is not what I like to see in movies, and with Resident Evil, again, there was an opportunity to do so much more. Anyway, with that out of the way, my next video will be my 10th video in this series, which is exciting, and it will feature Angelina Jolie donning the dual-wielding pistols yet again for Lara Croft Tomb Raider: The Cradle of Life. See you then.